Representative Omar, before this committee casts its vote on your recommendations for increased aid to Somalia, I believe the members ought to know about the $340,000 you have personally wired to Mogadishu over the past 4 years, and specifically who received those funds. Vice President J.D. Vance's voice cut through the air of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing room like a sharpened blade. Every single head turned, while the cameras from C-SPAN and the various news networks swiveled instantly from Ilhan Omar at the witness table toward the door where Vance had just made his entrance. This was far from normal procedure, as vice presidents did not typically attend committee hearings, particularly those to which they had not been invited. Yet there he stood, striding down the center aisle with FBI Director Christopher Wray and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent flanking him like prosecutors closing in on a defendant. Omar froze in the middle of her sentence, having been 30 minutes into her testimony regarding the humanitarian crisis in Somalia, the necessity for increased American aid, and the moral obligation to assist refugees. The Democratic members of the committee had been nodding in sympathetic agreement, while the Republicans had appeared bored, though not outwardly hostile. Everything had been proceeding exactly as planned until the Vice President of the United States walked in, clutching a folder stamped with classified markings. Committee Chairman Jim Risch looked just as confused as everyone else in the room, stammering that this was highly irregular as they were in the middle of testimony. Vance replied that he was fully aware, walking straight to the witness table where Omar sat and setting the heavy folder down directly in front of her. He stated that while Representative Omar was testifying about U.S. policy toward Somalia and which organizations should receive taxpayer money, the committee needed to be informed about her personal financial connections to designated terrorist organizations before making any decisions based on her expertise. The room immediately erupted into chaos, with reporters leaning forward eagerly and committee members speaking over one another in confusion. Omar's face had transformed from an expression of confidence to a pale, stricken look in a matter of seconds. Vance opened the folder and pulled out what appeared to be bank records and wire transfer documents, all of which had Omar's name clearly visible on them. He announced over the noise that there were 47 separate wire transfers between January 2020 and October 2024, totaling exactly $340,000. All of these funds were sent through money transfer services to a single recipient in Mogadishu named Ahmed Nur Saeed, who was her brother-in-law. Vance placed the documents onto the table where the cameras could capture them, revealing Omar's signature, her bank account numbers, the specific amounts, and the dates. He explained that Ahmed Nur Saeed operated a business known as Bakara Trading Company, which the Treasury Department had designated as a terrorism financing entity in 2023. Ahmed himself was on the FBI terrorism watch list, and Vance declared that they had traced the $340,000 through Hawala networks directly to al-Shabaab operatives and the very terrorists she claimed to have fled from as a child. Omar attempted to speak, but no sound escaped her lips as she stared at the documents as if they were poisonous. These were her bank records and her transactions, showing money going to a brother-in-law she had never mentioned in any financial disclosure forms. Chairman Risch finally found his voice, noting that these were serious allegations and asking if there was evidence to support them. Vance replied that he had 18 months of FBI investigation data, at which point Wray stepped forward to open his own folder. He listed wire transfer records, NSA intercepts of Ahmed Nur Saeed coordinating with al-Shabaab commanders, and Treasury Department tracing that showed Representative Omar's funds being used to finance terrorist operations. Wray stated firmly that this was not merely an allegation, but rather a documented fact. The ranking Democrat, Senator Ben Cardin, looked stricken as he asked Representative Omar if she wished to respond to these accusations. Omar's mouth opened and closed while her hands gripped the witness table, for she had come to advocate for Somalia and position herself as a moral voice. But now she sat facing evidence of terrorism financing. With C-SPAN broadcasting live, she stammered that those wire transfers were simply to help family members. Vance interrupted her, instructing Director Ray to show the committee exactly where the money went. Ray displayed a chart illustrating the flow of money from Omar's bank account to the transfer service, then to Ahmed Noor Saeed, and finally to a network of individuals. Those individuals were flagged as al-Shabaab financiers and operatives, and Ray stated matter-of-factly that they had traced $34,000 directly to people involved in terrorist attacks. He cited the Mogadishu hotel bombing in 2022 and the attack on African Union peacekeepers in 2023, noting that both operations utilized money that originated from Representative Omar's wire transfers. Omar stood up abruptly, shouting that this was Islamophobia and that she was being targeted because she was a Muslim who spoke out. Vance calmly retorted that this was evidence, not bias, noting that bank records do not have religious prejudice and wire transfers are not Islamophobic. He told her that sending $340,000 to a designated terrorism financier is a federal crime. He pointed out that she did this while serving in Congress, while having access to classified briefings about al-Shabaab, and while voting on foreign policy that affected Somalia. Pulling out voting records, he noted she voted against designating al-Shabaab as a foreign terrorist organization in 2021 and opposed sanctions on Somali entities in 2022. He accused her of pushing for increased aid to Somalia that would flow through organizations her family controlled, arguing that every vote she cast benefited her family's interests. He stated she wasn't representing Minnesota, but rather Mogadishu, while the Democratic committee members looked like they wanted to be anywhere else, and the Republicans looked energized. The cameras captured every second of Omar's face, cycling through emotions of defiance, panic, anger, and fear. Omar demanded her attorney with a shaking voice, to which Vance agreed she would need one because the FBI had more than just terrorism financing to discuss. He instructed Director Ray to tell the committee about the marriage fraud, and just like that, Ilhan Omar realized this was about everything being exposed on live television. 4 hours earlier, she had been in her congressional office reviewing her testimony, feeling confident that this was her moment to shine as an expert witness. Her chief of staff had told her it was perfect, noting she could position herself as the moral voice on refugee issues and attack the administration's policy. Omar had nodded, reading through prepared remarks that were emotional and personal, planning to talk about fleeing Somalia and the American dream. She intended to pivot to policy, arguing that America wasn't doing enough and that the humanitarian crisis required more aid, knowing it would play perfectly with her base. Her communications director had predicted Republican attacks, advising her to turn it around on them as being anti-immigrant. Omar had been confident, saying she was testifying about saving lives, but she could not have imagined what was happening in a secure facility in Virginia at that exact moment. Vice President J.D. Vance had been reviewing the final version of an 18-month FBI investigation that would destroy her, which had started in June 2023, when the Treasury flagged unusual wire transfers. They had found 47 transfers structured just under the reporting threshold, a classic money laundering pattern that led the FBI to open a counterterrorism investigation. What they found was worse than anyone expected, and Vance sat in the sensitive compartmented information facility with his team, all holding top-secret clearances and evidence that would end a congressional career. He asked them to walk him through it one more time to ensure they had her dead to rights before he entered the hearing. Ray opened the primary evidence binder, detailing her history as a refugee who became a congresswoman, contrasting her public story with the systematic criminal activity they had uncovered. He pulled out financial records showing that between 2020 and 2024, she made 47 wire transfers totaling $340,000 to her brother-in-law in Mogadishu. Vance looked at surveillance photos of Ahmed Noor Saeed meeting with known al-Shabaab operatives and asked how they knew he was a terrorist financier. Ray explained that multiple sources confirmed it, noting that the Treasury designated his business as a terrorism financing entity and that the NSA had intercepts of him coordinating with al-Shabaab commanders. He showed translated conversations discussing fund transfers and operational needs, while Treasury Secretary Vance added that they traced the money through the Hawala network with help from Somali government sources. The chart showed the money flowing from Omar to Ahmed, then distributing to 18 recipients confirmed to be al-Shabaab members or facilitators. They could directly connect $34,000 from Omar's transfers to two specific terrorist attacks that killed nearly 30 people. Vance absorbed the fact that she had funded terrorist attacks while serving in Congress, and Ray confirmed it got worse due to her voting record. Her voting record showed she consistently voted in ways that benefited al-Shabaab, such as voting no on designating them as a terrorist organization and opposing sanctions. She had pushed amendments to increase aid to organizations her family had connections to, using her congressional position to advance policies that benefited terrorists. The NSA director added that they had been monitoring her communications under a FISA warrant since April 2023, which showed her discussing U.S. policy and legislation with her brother-in-law. She was coordinating with him and using her position to help him. And while the evidence was overwhelming, Vance knew she would claim Islamophobia. He asked about the marriage fraud, noting it had been alleged for years but never proven. The White House counsel revealed they finally had DNA evidence obtained from a sample taken during a traffic violation arrest, which they compared to Ahmed Nur Said Elmi's DNA. The results showed a 99.9% probability they were siblings, meaning when Omar married him in 2009, she had married her brother to get him U.S. residency status. Vance read the definitive DNA report, realizing it destroyed her long-standing defense, and the Treasury added that there was also tax evasion involving $250,000 in unreported income. Furthermore, her campaign had paid her husband's consulting firm $2.8 million for services that did not appear to exist, constituting a violation of federal election law. Vance sat back, taking in the totality of the corruption case, which included terrorism financing, immigration fraud, tax evasion, and campaign finance violations. He decided then and there to go to the hearing and expose the evidence on live television, stating he was ending her career that day. When his team called it unprecedented, Vance argued he was not ambushing a witness but exposing a terrorist financier who held a congressional seat. The hearing began at 2 p.m. with Chairman Risch welcoming Omar, who took her seat and launched into her emotional testimony about the crisis in Somalia. She called for more funding and engagement, making it sound noble and humanitarian, while Democratic senators nodded along sympathetically. She was hitting her stride and expecting to be on MSNBC by that night, but then the doors opened and Vice President Vance walked in uninvited. The room went silent as he headed straight for the witness table, and Omar watched him approach with confusion that turned to fear when she saw the classified folder. Vance set the folder down with a thump, telling the chairman that the committee needed to know about Omar's financial connections to terrorist organizations before voting. The room erupted again as Vance presented the bank records showing the $340,000 sent to her brother-in-law, a designated terrorist financier. Omar tried to claim they were family transfers, but Vance stated flatly that she was financing terrorism. Director Ray stepped forward to show the money trail flowcharts, identifying 18 recipients on terrorism watch lists and connecting the funds to specific deadly attacks. The committee room fell deathly silent as Senator Lindsey Graham asked if she had sent the money, to which she replied she didn't know what they were doing with it. Vance interrupted, pointing out she was on the Foreign Affairs Committee and received classified briefings, so she should have known exactly what her brother-in-law was doing. Senator Rubio brought up her voting record, and Vance read through the instances where she voted to protect al-Shabaab and funnel aid to her family's interests. Senator Ted Cruz expressed anger that she was funding terrorists with personal money while trying to send taxpayer money to them as well. Omar shouted that this was Islamophobia and an attack on her for being a Muslim woman, but Vance cut through her volume. He stated calmly that bank records and wire transfers do not have religious bias and that providing material support to foreign terrorist organizations is a federal crime punishable by prison. Senator Chris Murphy, looking pained, asked her to explain the transfers, and when she claimed ignorance, Ray interrupted with evidence of NSA intercepts where she discussed policy with her brother-in-law. Vance stated she was using her congressional position to help terrorists, then asked Secretary Besant to reveal the tax evasion evidence. Besant explained the unreported $250,000 and the campaign finance fraud involving the $2.8 million paid to her husband's shell company. Then Vance pulled out the most explosive evidence, the DNA report proving she had married her biological brother. The committee room exploded with noise as Vance announced the 99.9% probability that they were siblings, accusing her of immigration and marriage fraud. Senator Tom Cotton stood up, clarifying that a sitting member of Congress had committed fraud to get her brother, who had terrorist ties, into the country. Omar screamed that it was a lie and fabricated, but Vance maintained that the DNA test was scientific fact from a federal laboratory. He turned to face her directly, telling her she had betrayed the country that gave her safety and opportunity by funding the very terrorists she claimed to flee. He accused her of being a fraud who exploited her refugee story for personal gain while wiring money to terrorists. Chairman Risch tried to adjourn, but Senator Cotton refused, demanding answers from the witness under oath. Omar remained silent as she was grilled about the money, the marriage, and the taxes, leading Senator Rubio to move for an immediate referral to the DOJ and expulsion from the House. Senator Cotton seconded the motion, and the Democrats, seeing the overwhelming evidence, realized they could not defend her. Senator Murphy agreed the matter should be referred to the DOJ, and as Omar asked for her attorney, Vance told her she would have plenty of time for that. Director Ray then read a formal statement informing her that a federal grand jury had returned an indictment and she was to be taken into custody. Omar turned white, protesting that they couldn't arrest a sitting member of Congress, but Ray corrected her, stating that the protections did not apply to felonies or terrorism. The hearing room erupted as the arrest happened on live television, with Omar shaking so badly she could barely walk toward the exit. She found 6 FBI agents waiting in the hallway, who moved efficiently to arrest her while cameras captured every second. The lead agent read her rights as the handcuffs clicked shut, echoing in the hallway while colleagues watched in shocked silence. Omar shouted about political persecution as she was led away, but an agent quietly reminded her that the evidence was factual, not political. The elevator doors closed on her career, and, back in the room, the committee voted unanimously to recommend her expulsion. The footage of her arrest and the evidence presentation went viral immediately, with headlines everywhere declaring a congresswoman had been arrested for terrorism financing. By evening, the House scheduled an expulsion vote, and even her progressive allies distanced themselves from her. That night, Omar sat in protective custody, listening to her lawyer explain that the evidence was overwhelming and she should consider a plea deal. He explained that if she went to trial, she could face 25 years or life, but a guilty plea might get her 10 years. The next morning, the House voted 376 to 54 to expel her, making her the 3rd fastest expulsion in history. Her criminal trial began in February 2025, and despite her defense claiming political persecution, the jury found her guilty on all counts after just 3 days of deliberation. The judge sentenced her to 23 years in federal prison and recommended her citizenship be revoked, noting she had betrayed the country and had blood on her hands. Omar broke down, realizing she would be deported after her sentence. Denaturalization proceedings began immediately, and by June 2025, her citizenship was revoked. 6 months later, she was serving her time in a Florida prison, isolated and despised by other inmates as a terrorist. Her family abandoned her, her husband divorced her, and her children changed their names and refused to visit. The political fallout was immense, with her district electing a Republican Somali-American woman who condemned her actions. Omar's appeals went nowhere, and in December 2026, she learned that Somalia had agreed to accept her for deportation upon her release. Her lawyer told her bluntly that it was not his problem what happened to her after deportation, as she had lost because the evidence was overwhelming. For years, she faded into obscurity, becoming just another inmate working in the prison laundry. 5 years in, she received a letter from her son stating he wanted nothing to do with her, which she read without crying, having gone numb years prior. She was denied parole multiple times for failing to show remorse, finally being granted release after 15 years at the age of 57. ICE agents immediately took her into custody and put her on a flight to Mogadishu, where she landed to a cold reception from Somali authorities. She was left with $50 and nowhere to go, rejected by employers and the community because of her reputation. 1 year after deportation, a journalist found her living in a slum, and when asked if she regretted her actions, she only expressed regret for trusting the wrong people, still showing no real accountability. That was the last the world heard of her until she died of a heart attack at age 62 in her apartment, her body undiscovered for 3 days. There was no funeral and barely any news coverage, save for a brief mention in The Guardian. Her legacy had shifted from a refugee success story to a convicted terrorist and deported exile who died alone in poverty. She had paid for her choices not with bad press, but with prison and exile, a consequence that was exactly what she deserved.